So we are here. Thank you everyone for taking part in this webinar. Special thanks to our guests and speakers that actually accepted our invitation to be part of this very interesting discussion. My name is Nicholas Panagiotou. I'm an associate professor, for those of you that you don't know me, at Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, and I'm in charge of DCN Hub. This webinar, it is part of an effort that we have actually launched in the beginning of the quarantine period. And it is organized from Digital Communication Network Southeast Europe Hub, which is headquartered in Thessaloniki, Greece. It is arranged jointly by DCN also and World Learning. Digital Communication Network is a coalition of digital influencers for improving the information space, and as such is supported by the US Department of State, Office of Citizens Exchanges, whom we thank for their support and also for actually keeping the discussion live, a discussion that it is very important. And this is why we have actually chosen the following topic about COVID-19 and malign influence. And for that topic, we have with us Seth Jones, a very good friend of mine, and I'm just making reference because we spend a really nice time in Washington, DC, but also we have actually had a chance to run a very good research regarding disinformation. Seth Jones is from Center for Strategic and International Studies, a very well-known think tank based in Washington. He's a Harold Brown Chair. He's director of Transnational Threats Project, and he's a senior advisor at International Security Program. Also with us is Bob Pearson. Bob is an advocate and entrepreneurial and a very thorough and advisor regarding issues of digital communication. Bob, thank you very much also for accepting our invitation. And the third speaker is Franak. Franak is a vice president of Digital Communication Network, and actually someone with whom we launched this webinar series, along with a lot of other persons with whom we really thank. Seth, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thanks for that kind introduction, and really appreciate joining such a prestigious group. What I'd like to do is to talk a little bit about COVID-19, issues related to disinformation, and then broaden it back a little bit to what this means for competition more broadly. Because we are increasingly living in an era of competition among states. But it's not competition as many of us remember it from the Cold War, where the US and Western Europe was worried about a conventional invasion from Red Army forces, moving tanks across the Fulda Gap and the inter-German border. But it's an hourly struggle with countries like Russia and China that use irregular or asymmetric strategies and tactics, and it occurs not through tanks, but through cyber operations, proxies, private military companies, intelligence, espionage, economic, technological, and then broader, what you might call political warfare. But let me begin with an anecdote on COVID, which is an interesting one for us in the US. And that is, in mid-March of 2020, cell phones across the US lit up with alarming news. Citing a source in the Department of Homeland Security, a series of apocalyptic texts warned that the Trump administration was on the verge of deploying US soldiers to lock down the country as part of a quarantine in response to COVID-19. The text said, and I quote, "They will announce this. They'll announce the deployment of US soldiers as soon as they have troops in place to help prevent looters and rioters." The anonymous sender of the text said that his friend, quote, "got the call last night," meaning from the Department of Homeland Security, "and was told to pack and be prepared for the call today with his dispatch orders," end quote. The text and many like it urged recipients to spread the word further on texts. Similar messages warned of an imminent federal quarantine. Back in Washington, this is all true. The White House kicked into gear quickly. The National Security Council issued a tweet around midnight on March 15th, which said, quote, "Text message rumors of a national quarantine are fake. There is no national lockdown." Now, this might not surprise most people on the call. We've seen lots of fake news. We've seen disinformation. We've even seen them from countries, including the Russians. But in this particular case, as it became clear, and as newspapers started to report, this actually had its origins, the spread of information from Chinese intelligence, who forwarded text to Americans on their cell phones and posted false information on social media platforms. It was like pouring hot oil on Twitter, Facebook feeds, and texts. China was now weaponizing information by sending texts to cell phones on US soil in this case. But this wasn't the end of it. Just to use another example, Zhao Lijian, a Chinese spokesman for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, wrote on Twitter in March that the US Army might have brought COVID-19 to the Chinese city of Wuhan as part of sports games. And I'm quoting now, "It might be US Army who brought the epidemic to Wuhan," he said. "Be transparent, make public your data. US owes us an explanation." Of course, the claim that the US Army had infected individuals in Wuhan was ridiculous, without merit, and lacked even a shred of evidence. But it also didn't stop others from repeating this. The Russians, the Iranians piled on. They put forward conspiracy theories that COVID-19 was a US manufactured biological weapon targeting their countries. I mean, in many ways, for those who've studied disinformation during the Cold War, this was there was a very similar approach that service of the KGB used called Operation Denver. Some call it Operation Infection, where they tied the spread of the AIDS virus to the production at facilities at Fort Detrick, Maryland. So in many ways built on a old but effective tactic of tying a pandemic to government labs. And of course the US responds actually in similar ways, which I'm happy to talk about, then raising the prospect that maybe it was a Chinese lab that did it. What's important, I think, in all of this is that this is one of many facets of how we're seeing competition. The COVID-19 period is emblematic, I would argue, of competition that is and will likely continue to be inherently irregular in several spheres: intelligence, including intelligence organizations like the GRU, the MSS, elements of the PLA, and others, Iranian IRGC Quds Force and others, and potentially also Western European and North American ones. Disinformation, we often focus on the social media component of that, but it also includes hacking and then leaking information, as we saw during the 2016 elections in the US, economic warfare, political warfare, which I'll talk a little bit more about with both the Chinese and the Russian components of it. Competition doesn't discount cooperation. So this is not, for me, a black or white issue. And some of the competition on misinformation and disinformation we've seen over COVID doesn't mean that states can't cooperate. Competition is not necessarily bad. Sports teams do it. We see it with football teams, or soccer teams as we call them in the US, basketball, spelling bees, colleges and universities compete for the best students. So competition is not necessarily bad, but I do think it's inevitable in this case. It's inevitable in the sense that many of these countries have very different political and economic systems. We see even this week over Hong Kong, the Chinese system is different than the way it is in the West. It's an authoritarian regime. It does not support a free press. When we include the Russians and the Iranians, they're generally supporting state-run economies, not free market, at least not in the Western sense of the free market capitalist system. So their systems are, in a sense, competing with each other. And what I think is important as we look at COVID and disinformation is to understand how some of these countries are conceptualizing competition. What are the words they're using? So not just viewing it from our standpoint, from viewing it from theirs. The Chinese have terms for this. They use, and I have to apologize, I'm not a Mandarin speaker, so my pronunciation is less than ideal for some of the terms, but Fei Dui Sheng, asymmetric means, Zanzhong Zhanfa, three warfares, Xiao Jian, assassin's mace. The point here is that the Chinese do have terms for competition, less on the military side and primarily on the economic and technological side. They have conducted espionage for commercial use, dual use, that is both economic and military, and then military technology. From the US standpoint, the PLA has been involved, or the MSS have been involved in stealing information, D5 submarine launched ballistic missiles, F-35 cruise missiles, hypersonic missiles, and then just general US multinational companies from Ford Automotives to Apple. There's been political warfare. We've seen the Belt and Road Initiative used both for economic expansion, but also using it for political leverage, including in Europe on issues that matter to China. Issues like Taiwan, the status of the Uyghurs, territory on the South China Sea. We've seen it in terms of broader intelligence collection. People may forget the PLA was involved in probably the largest breach of sensitive information announced this year on a US company, Equifax, which holds credit card and broader credit information for Americans. As the US issued indictments for several PLA officers this year in February of 2020, it became public that the sensitive information, including social security numbers for half of all Americans was taken as part of this PLA breach. I'm not arguing for a McCarthy type scare as the period of really a hypersensitivity in the early Cold War period about communism, but I do think it is important that companies, that countries recognize that competition does exist, and that we see this with the Russians too. The Russians have used terms like active measures, Maskirovka. I used the Operation Denver example earlier. We've seen Russian operations in Ukraine, and again, not just the little green men, but also NotPetya, Black Energy. These are cyber operations to target critical infrastructure. We've seen them use Lebanese Hezbollah, Shia militias in Syria, lots of private military companies, including Wagner Group, whose head Prigozhin is a close associate of Vladimir Putin. So I think in this sense, what we have to see is that that disinformation on COVID-19 is one of many examples of strategy used by states to maximize their own influence and prevent broader concerns. The Chinese have done this not just with the origins of it, creating some doubt, but also, I think, overstating their reaction to it, and in some cases, faking numbers of those that have been infected and that have died. And also undermining its competitors. The US hit 100,000 deaths this week. So highlighting that, identifying through false means that the US may have been the cause of COVID with a US military delegation that supposedly went to Wuhan. Again, this has to be seen in broader competition. And I think that's what is more most important in looking at how disinformation is being used as part of the COVID situation. I'll end there and turn it back. Thanks.
Thank you, Seth. Thank you for your comments. Just to remind everyone that whatever questions you might have or you want to ask, please post them in our chat room, actually. And saying that, I would like now to pass the floor to Bob Pearson. Bob, once again, thank you very much for being here with us. The floor
My
is
pleasure, Nicholas. Thank you. And Seth, that was a great overview. And so what I will do is not repeat that, but go more into what's happening from a media standpoint and what we're seeing worldwide. My background is mainly private sector. So I've been working with top brands in the world for years, understanding human patterns, how do you shape behavior, and then also how do you protect organizations from bad actors. Done work over the years looking at counterfeiters extensively, how they move goods and services worldwide, how illegal drugs flow in and out of countries using digital means, how extremist groups form and communicate. And now, of course, we're looking at how countries are actually using asymmetric warfare through disinformation. The interesting thing is that they're all using the same media platforms, tools, and techniques. And bad actors are actually remarkably similar because we're all humans, and we follow much more of a pattern than we realize. So if we look at the media as a way to start, what we see worldwide is, there's 4.5 billion of us online out of about 7.6 billion people. There's 2 companies that actually reach the majority of the people in the world. So they're Facebook and Google, right? Facebook has 4 platforms that reach about 2.5 billion people. And Google, if you put in perspective of advertising, 1/3 of the digital spend worldwide is with Google. So it just gives you an idea of the reach there. The other thing that's happening is the way we consume content is changing. And so I've in talking with Snapchat, Facebook, Pandora, and others, what we see is that there's about 1 to 2 seconds before we make a decision on content. So at the same time, we're getting more content than ever. We're making quicker decisions than ever of what we think is right or wrong. And you can argue that that's just the way it is, but it also makes it easier for people to consume disinfo and share it and without even thinking. And then the other thing that's happening in the media is, for many of us, we grew up with mainstream media as the way that we were informed. But as we know, the majority of the world is actually getting their information through social media, and an increasing number of people are moving into message platforms, which in most cases are encrypted, not all, or they all say they're encrypted, but not all are truly. And then gaming. If we look at gaming as an example, there's nearly 3 billion people in the world that say they're gamers. And you're going to see gaming become more and more of an e-commerce type platform where we can work and play in the same platform. There's no reason that we wouldn't as time goes on. So that's one aspect of it. The next gets into, how do bad actors work? And whether it's a country or a drug dealer or extremist or, counterfeiter, what I'm finding is that they're pretty smart and they're learning from each other. So if you, for example, go on Twitter and you build bot networks, and each bot network engages with the same group of fake people, you get engagement that then fools the algorithms for search, which then leads people to websites that then takes them to places that they shouldn't be. So bad actors are very good at working across platform and actually fooling us. But for some reason, at least in the Western world, we get very focused on one channel at a time. So we find ourselves arguing about Facebook or Twitter, and we completely miss the point of how they're actually working right alongside us to impact us. The other thing we're seeing is, I noticed this in looking at drug dealing online, and realized that this is something that bad actors are doing as well, is they seed the content infrastructure. So what that means is you set up a ghost account in Instagram, and it has a number for WhatsApp in their bio that will take you into a group in WhatsApp where you can talk privately. or you go into a Q&A engine and you actually put in comments, but also some additional information that will tell you where to go in the dark web. And so the ability to go into plain sight and then go into where you can't be seen has never been easier for bad actors to operate. So that's another aspect of this. The other thing that is happening is, this is more of a policy move that I'm seeing, is that if we go back to the beginning of the internet and then into the 90s and then into even the last decade, we were talking about privacy. And we'd say, our privacy is important, and it is important. And it's, I think Europe has probably done a better job than anyone of addressing that. Whether you agree with everything that's been done, they've taken it the most serious. But now we see a move from privacy to safety concerns. We're not so worried about privacy, we're more worried about our safety, whether it's elections or our family or something else. And when you get into safety, you've now moved into Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And when you mess with safety, food, shelter, things like that, everyone stops thinking clearly. And we start just saying, okay, what do we do to protect ourselves? So that could lead to more regulation or not. It leads to more fear. It's something that we have to address. So that gets into then what else is happening here and what can we do about it? And so, on the I guess the less positive side, if we look at psychological modeling, what we have already noticed in the online world for a while is that people are choosing their lanes. They're choosing where to get their information. They end up getting more comfortable, and then that's what they learn by. What we know from studying humans worldwide online are a couple things. One is that there's never more than 50 people who drive the majority of share of conversation for a topic, even though there may be thousands of people talking about something. We know that there's usually not more than 15 keywords that the majority of people are actually using to search to find something. And we know that in general, people usually don't use more than 4 channels to consistently go to in a given day. So even though if we look at our phones, we may have like 50 apps on them. We really, if you think about it, you don't go to too many of them consistently every day. And so what's happening is by choosing our lane, we end up getting into what we would call confirmation bias. We keep hearing the things that reinforce what we think are true. They could be true, they may not be. And that gets into the future of technology and what will happen. So it's never been easier to, for example, use natural language processing to create a story and say, okay, I'm going to make this story 95% accurate and just change one fact. And then tomorrow, same thing, but just change one fact. So what it appears you're getting is real news, but it may actually be not quite real news. Or you have things like audio compression, where if I'm listening to the speakers here and I'm downloading what you're saying, I can use audio compression techniques to then change some of the words you said, upload it, and then send it out. And it says that, Bob Pearson said X, but I really didn't. And that's a very common technique. It was originally developed actually for war correspondents, so they could actually get across their information quicker from tough parts of the world. So that's there's a lot going on. And why the reason I raise all this is we have to get better at psychological modeling. We have to get much better at understanding how humans behave online. And we have to get much better at understanding what innovation do we need to stay ahead of bad actors. Now, that being said, on the positive side, one of the things that I am seeing emerging, and I'm hearing leaders talk about this, is a new form of corporate social responsibility may be emerging, where we say, wait a second, this isn't about Russia and China interfering with the US or Macedonia or France or whatever. It is more than that. It is actually bad actors are selling counterfeit goods and services. They're reaching children with illegal drugs. They're impacting our companies, our communities, and our citizens. And so that's a time where the private sector can actually step up and say, you know what? This is kind of like environmentalism / climate change or other topics we've had in the past. What can we do to make a difference? How do we join with the public sector to go after bad actors? And I'll leave with one other thought and then go to Franek, is that when you look at a country like China and how they operate, I think of like a consumer packaged goods company. Because if you're a consumer packaged goods company and you have $1 billion to spend on a product, you're completely focused. You know exactly what you're doing locally. You never veer off the path, and you're just relentless in order to sell whatever you want to sell. That's how China is. China works very clearly, very focused. They know exactly what they're doing. And the problem with most of the world is that we're so fragmented that we actually play into their hands. So the good guys have to actually work together so we can be better, as good as a great consumer packaged goods company to come back and push back and actually combat this. Otherwise, we will play what we call in the States whack-a-mole for our entire lives, just talking about things, complaining about things, putting pressure on groups, and it will lead to nothing. So it's really important that we come together on what we can do. And with that, I will turn it over to Franek.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you very much for your valuable comments. Just before passing the floor to Franek, just to make a short mention, we started with Seth Jones from CSIS. Seth actually described the whole environment and presented the geopolitical aspect and some historical aspects. Bob actually contributed to that and moved it forward. And I really like the point that you mentioned about that it's not only about state actors, but we should equally see it as a general issue of how private companies actually protect the rights of citizens or consumers or whatever. So now we pass the floor to Franek. Franek, the floor is yours. And thank you for being here with us.
Thank you, Nikos. Thank you, Bob, Seth. It was a great introduction. I will try to go more deeply into instruments, how this influence is employed, how the impact of this influence, both by China, Russia, other actors, can be measured. But I'd like to start with my work in American University. The very last month before graduation, I was working on the paper. It was my diploma project, how the United States can be better in competition with China. And back then, we didn't speak about, this organized social network pages, accounts, channels, COVID disinformation. Back then, the biggest threat was coming from Confucius centers, from cultural diplomacy projects. But since 2018, for 2 years, everything changed dramatically. So China literally built an empire, an infrastructure on all layers of the digital space, from creating the botnets, which are much more efficient, faster, and clever, to the very hidden layer like computer games, where China basically built control over the biggest game producers and managed to impose the censorship in computer and video games, which sounds crazy. I have some slides for you. So I want to start with the typology of disinformation during COVID. So very often we think about disinformation only in the context of conspiracies. So Soros is doing something, Bill Gates, put chips in bodies, etc., etc. But basically, disinformation, it's not just to play with emotions of people on sensitive topics, but it's more about disorganizing society. The important thing and important difference of disinformation during COVID, both by Russia and China, that it is not centralized and it's not coordinated. It's very, very chaotic. And these disinformation channels and disinformation narratives, they are spread simultaneously on all possible platforms to fill out all possible niches. One of the examples of disinformation that cannot be traced or tracked, these are disinformation through no-name pages, groups, and channels. Who knows, for example, what are these three brands? I think nobody knows them, but all of them, each of them has more than 1 billion video views. All these three brands are viral Facebook and Instagram projects that belong to Russia Today. Basically, for these 2 years, since 2018, the major propaganda creators and disinformation sources, they moved from large and powerful channels and outlets to the strategy of employing small and many. Russia Today, it's not only RT and Sputnik. RT still is important. It is still propaganda channel, but the biggest impact is made on the level of the niche, smaller micro projects, which we never pay attention to and which actually impossible to trace. Another thing about COVID is the noise. So many messages, and it doesn't matter who is behind these messages, either the Western democracies, politicians, or China or Russia, they do not have chance to get directly to receiver. All these messages are manipulated on their way to the final receiver. They can be distorted. And the good professional in propaganda knows very well. And when I was studying the narratives by China and Russia during COVID, I found out that the narratives posted by major media outlets, they are flexible enough. They allow, they let interpretation. So users who read, for example, news from Russia Today about Bill Gates and his project in Africa several years ago, they can add this story, fill out this story with their own fantasy. So propaganda, efficient propaganda, it is always inclusive enough, and it's always flexible enough for being rethought and repackaged. Russian propaganda right now is a very complex system. It's not only, as I mentioned, Russia Today or Sputnik, but it's the game on all possible levels. And if Russia is learning from China on how to use surveillance technologies, big data, AI, China is learning from Russia how to use social networks. And the investigation I will mention in a second, made by BBC a few days ago, it shows that basically China created the network of bots and pro-Chinese channels in the same way as Russia was doing for years. The important part of this game and of this competition, as Seth defined in the beginning, it's happening in the part of the internet which is not open to the public user, which is impossible to Google, in private chats, in Telegram channels, in Facebook groups. The owner of the apartment which I rent here in Minsk, she is not reading Radio Free Europe or Reuters or CNN. She is receiving information from Viber chats. It's her only one source of information and the only source she really trusts. And I must admit, I never heard before the chats she was mentioning. And when she showed me, I saw 300,000 Belarusians subscribe to this chat, to these networks of chats. So in this part of the internet, there is this weaponized part of propaganda, which is the most dangerous, because it's not possible to track it, and because it's mimicking the traditional media, influencers, or activists. There are 7 types of people, and this is another investigation by BBC. 7 types of people they defined who share consciously or not on purpose disinformation online. So, of course, we often speak today about China and Russia, but very often this disinformation and these messages are multiplied by the guys who didn't intend to. For example, celebrities in Russia wearing and promoting the special souvenir, like the medal or like medallion that you have to put on your neck, which protects you from coronavirus. And this idea came from the conspiracy that there is a magic, behind, this coronavirus thing. And the influencers, celebrities, just made the business of this conspiracy. So they managed to monetize the conspiracy. We can't accuse them because it's their main goal, to make profit. But what we can do, we can to make the price, the cost of lying publicly bigger for them. On one hand, companies like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter can do this. On the other hand, public opinion must reveal this kind of tricks and this kind of unintended disinformation. There are two major tactics used by Chinese and Russian channels. First one is a fan type, when there is one small or big outlet which shares the disinfo, the fake news, the conspiracy, and dozens other who just repost it. So that they somehow do not take responsibility for the source. What they do, they just repost it. Sometimes these reposts are made for money, and sometimes it is made for with political intention. Trojan horse, it's the tactic of mimicking. We see many pages mimicking. Even in Ukraine, one of the most popular news resources, it's called BBC CNN UA. So basically they combine BBC CNN. So it's not disinformation source, it's a news aggregator, but still, this practice, which is very bad and very dangerous, of mimicking traditional journalism or other people, which confuse people, is not good. Narratives, and it's my final part. Narratives of China and Russia are similar, but also different same time. Because when China, in this great power competition mentioned by Seth, it's always playing long game. Russia, it's more tactical game. It's more focused on disorienting the West, winning time, resources, and political impact. And 2 cases from last week. So China, BBC revealed the network of 1,300 Chinese accounts, channels, and pages on different social networks, which are basically sharing pro-Chinese messages, revealing and attacking anti-Chinese authors, publishers, and media, trying to justify Chinese policy towards COVID. So they employed not just one network, they employed all the networks. The messages were distributed both by real people and bots. And can you imagine that this network existed for months, for 6-12 months, and no one revealed it before? So it's like a cyber attack. You put the weaponized module and you launch it after 1 year, after 2 years, when you're ready. So China was preparing this operation for years, perhaps. And now when COVID happened and China really needs to work on its reputation, They just mobilize, this network. And Telegram. Telegram is a messenger used popular in Eastern Europe, in Russia particularly. But China, as I mentioned, they learn from Russia actively. They are trying to buy accounts and to buy content placements in Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarus Telegram accounts. And the message is very simple. I can translate. We ask you, that's the message received by my friend. I asked him to share and to make screenshot. We ask you to help us to create positive image of China. For each post in your channel, we can offer up to $500. But the only condition, you should never tell anyone about our collaboration. We are ready to transfer this money with PayPal in Bitcoin. And they clarify what kind of information they need, anything that help to justify Chinese politics, attitude, and strategy towards COVID. What we need more fact-checking, we need more journalism, and we need more cross-sectoral partnerships. We need journalists to work with NGOs, investigators work with developers. We need influencers, celebrities to work with international organizations on revealing, debunking disinformation narratives, etc. We need more partnerships, more work together, and we need technology to be employed for good. Here, I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Franak. I think that thank you very much for your valuable comments as well, and especially I think that your presentation was very helpful in order actually to understand how in the digital space we see this Malign influence being developed, as the previous speakers also mentioned. Just before I pass the floor to the questions that we have received, I just want to remind you all that you can post your questions in the chat room. Our webinar today is regarding malign influence and COVID-19. Malign influence that have actually exploited a pandemic, an event that it has been witnessed and felt all over the world, so it was easier to exploit it, but also it have triggered a kind of competition, especially from specific powers, in order to exploit China and Russia, in order to exploit it and actually target Western Europe and Western democracies in general. So saying that, I would just actually like to bring the questions that we have received. One was technical. Bob, thank you for responding on the chat room, actually. I will go on with what we have received from Nazin. Nazin Orhon actually asks that apparently there's no longer the real content of the audience available and produced by the audiences themselves. So the question is, what kind of institutionalized content taken over? They are paid or somehow propaganda, so they look the scenery. Can we say this? So actually Nazin argues that we have to move beyond what we have known as the audience. The audience have changed. And he wants actually, the question is to all of you regarding how these changes in audiences help this malign influence to spread out. Who wants to take the floor first? Okay, let me then pass the word. Do you want to start, Bob, and respond because you mentioned something about it, and then we move to Seth and then Frana.
Sure.
The change in the audience field, because you mentioned about the necessity of the private sector to protect the audience, etc.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things. One, we know this from the private sector that when people pay for content, the audience actually does realize that it's fake over time. And it's very interesting because when we look at people putting out, like dozens of people putting out paid content that's positive because they're trying to promote a product or a service, what happens over time is there's less engagement. The audiences usually distance themselves away from those people because inside their brain, subconsciously, they know that this isn't real. So in general, we have an ability to innately understand that. The difference, I think, with what's happening now is we're getting too much information hitting us in too many places, and it starts to become a reality that we accept. So if you are getting paid content or content generated by those who are paid to put it out in some form, and you're seeing it in your every social channel you go to, and you start to think, well, maybe it's true. And that's that confirmation bias that we all are very concerned about, that changes things. But in general, we're given a chance, we're pretty good at understanding it, but the problem is we're getting overwhelmed. And Pranik and Seth were getting at this, but Pranik, you and I had talked about, like, if we looked, I think it was through April, or even March rather, there were like 110 campaigns from Russia to disinform people about COVID-19. So it's not one or two campaigns, it's a steady onslaught to just overwhelm us. And overwhelming, unfortunately, can work to disinform.
Great. Seth, do you want to respond?
Yeah. It's a really good question. It's an important subject. I mean, I think of this in almost sports terms. I think part of the issue that each of us has to think through, particularly in looking at how organizations are getting out information, especially from paid sources, and the evolution in audiences is we've got to better. Each of us has to play defense better, and that is, where are we getting our information? From what sources? Do those sources have editors? Do they have fact checkers? Where to the degree we know this, where are they getting their funding from? Is it advertising? Is it other sources that may bias their conclusions? How are we educating our children, not necessarily just our own, but in schools, about doing this? I know in our local school system, there's been a push towards more footnotes when you're putting out information. And I think mediums like what the European Union has done on highlighting disinformation and misinformation and examples of it are important ways to sort of play defense. And part of playing defense means identifying where there are concerns about confirmation bias or selection bias. And I think also, are we getting information from multiple sources? From the right of the political spectrum and the left of the political spectrum, rather than just getting information as part of echo chambers. So I consider this part of sort of the defense side. There's also the offense side, which is actually pushing back against false information. We can all do this individually where we identify it. Most of us are engaged in social media through Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and identifying examples where we see misinformation, disinformation. Many of those involved in writing publicly can do this in our writing. I also think one area that we have to be very careful is that we're also in playing offense in that sense, is that we're not actually doing this ourselves. And I think where the West has run into problems, and I'll use the US as an example. I mean, one of the big issues in the last 24, 48 hours in the US is the US president's targeting of Joe Scarborough from MSNBC. I don't have a political bent in this fight, but there's been this accusation of his involvement in a murder that is just factually untrue, and it keeps being repeated on Twitter. I mean, this is outright disinformation. So our ability to point out these both on defense and offense is undermined if we're contributing to untruths. So I think we've also got to hold our own politicians on the West accountable for when they do this. And we've got useful media sites that do fact checking. So I think there are ways to play defense and offense, but I think where we run into problems is when we start to do it ourselves. That's not helpful.
Thank you, Seth. Franak?
Yeah, I'll try to take also the next question about what entities mandated to deal with this. So there are multiple entities and they're doing great work. In the United States, there is Global Engagement Center, which coordinates all activities related to disinformation. There are actually exchange programs in our participants. I see Matt Jacobs, who is working with government representatives in Europe by bringing them to the United States, and education. So, for example, what we can do, we can empower our allies across the world. So we shouldn't do everything directly by ourselves. There is, since Cold War time, when the Voice of America and Radio for Europe was launched, there was such mindset. We need to give a proper response to Soviets, to Moscow. So we launched the broadcaster, we rented antenna. When we were not able to reach people, there was balloon, we're broadcasting and bringing leaflets into the cities behind the Iron Curtain. But perhaps we don't need to do this by ourselves. We need to empower these voices which are already in places. So, for example, Matt Jacobs, he works with government communication specialists in Europe. What we can do, we can teach them to communicate better. We can teach them to be better in media literacy, in critical thinking. We can teach them how to use social networks better, how to identify fake news, how to report fake news. Because unfortunately, government specialists in Balkans don't have access to this knowledge. We also can, this messaging, this paradigm, the mindset, we need to message, to make the counter message. It's not working. We will be always losing. Adversaries in China and Russia and ISIS will be always better because their message will be sexier, faster, more like eatable, digestible, more than ours, because we will be boring and too serious for people. But what we have to do, we have to give, more power, more knowledge, more information, more data to those in the ground, to those in the field, including influencers, YouTubers. Here in Minsk, I'm just, following the live stream in Minsk. We have YouTuber, the guy who made the audience to 100,000 people on YouTube, and he is the prominent leader of opposition right now for 1 month after he say he will go against Lukashenko. And perhaps we will have a revolution in a few months because thanks to YouTube, he has a nickname, YouTube Project, in Belarus. But these are guys, who must be empowered.
Thank you, Franak. Let us move to the next question. Anastasia Vana is thanking you everyone for this interesting webinar. She would like to ask, what can we do as citizens and social media users in order to avoid malign influence and these efforts on social media and internet? So the issue of the user has been brought up, and what the user can be equipped with in order to combat these efforts. Let me start from Franak and then to Seth and then to Bob. Franak. Unmute, Franak.
Can I pass to Bob? I think Bob will be better too.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah. One of the things that I'm seeing happen is a need for educational curriculums to be built. And so when you get into the fundamentals of disinformation, the problem that we're seeing overall is everyone agrees there's a problem. We all talk about the problem, but we need to learn about how it happens. Franak was like walking through some of those examples. So if we teach ourselves how it happens, if we understand the tools and techniques and platforms that are out there that can combat it, and then we can start to actually put in protective measures, not just for ourselves, but for our organizations or the groups that we care about. Could be our communities. But that is a key. I think we're going too fast, and we need to step back and look at the fundamentals of what's actually happening and how to combat it. And there are some very important curriculums that are in development in the near future on that.
Okay, Seth or Franak, do you want to respond also to this question, or shall we move to the next one?
I don't have anything additional to add. I agree with Bob. I mean, I talked earlier in the response to the previous question about,
Okay.
on both
So
the defensive side and the offense. I think that probably incorporates most of my views on this.
So we have a unanimous vote towards Bob response. So the next question is from Stefan. Bob responded to that. So I just want to bring the issue because I think it's very important. Stephen asks, what entities first within the US government and then globally UN perhaps are tasked, mandated to deal with this? And he actually brings the issue that we are fragmented against adversaries, that they have a more coherent approach. Franak mentioned that, but let me start with Seth. Seth, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So on the one hand, I mean, I think it's certainly true that the U.S. has a fragmented approach. I mean, part of the resourcing in the U.S. is in the State Department. That's generally where it has been historically, in the Global Engagement Center at State. But there are lots of other entities that have various components of this in the U.S. military, including at U.S. Cyber Command. The intelligence community in the U.S. has some that does some of this activity, and there are other entities, including the Department of Homeland Security, on the counterintelligence side, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. But it is pretty fragmented. And let me just highlight, and it's not just fragmented, but it's horribly resourced. The resourcing in general pales in comparison to what it was, let's say, during parts of the Cold War. In fact, I mean, my own view, competition, because we started out along those lines in the U.S., and I think this is the reality of the response to Stephen's question is the U.S. is just terribly resourced and focused on the information side of competition. Is still heavily militarized in regards to both the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians, for that matter, building weapon systems, not stuff along these lines, where most of the capabilities then lie in the private sector. They lie along the organizations that Bob mentioned earlier and Frank mentioned earlier. They're the Silicon Valley companies that are involved in this. We've seen this recently with Twitter's now adding references in some of the US president's tweets that are less than accurate. We've seen this in attempts to take down far-right Islamic State activity that's trying to recruit individuals, or disinformation in their platforms. And I think it's a real problem. The thing that I would just highlight is, where I think the West got this most effectively is probably in the later stages of the Cold War in the 1980s, where the US did fund information sources. The US Information Agency doubled its budget for over the first 6 years of the 1980s, and beamed in Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty into Eastern Europe. It was not misinformation or disinformation. It generally provided information on what was going on around the world, including within these countries. So I think it's a real gap right now that Stephen identifies within the US on no centralized organization, and to the degree that there are they're terribly funded. Just one comment on countries like China. There certainly are benefits to centralized information sources, and the Chinese do have that. The Chinese also, I think, have better doctrine at the moment for information. If we look at the three warfares, the three warfares include media warfare. If you look at how the Chinese have organized themselves, psychological warfare is the second element, and the final one is legal warfare. So they're incorporated quite importantly into Chinese doctrine, the role of information. Where they're weak, and I think is, any organization that tries to run, through state means information, tries to other types of information that may be critical of the government or the Communist Party, or that provide platforms and systems or apps that are blocked by state-run media programs. I think those countries are in the end vulnerable because people generally want open information. So I think where countries like China and Russia may have advantages in centralized information and may be better organized for it right now, they're also going to be vulnerable because they don't support a free flow of information. I think what history suggests is that most people in most places prefer multiple sources of information over time, and attempts to run it by the state end up being problematic over the long run.
Thank you, Seth. Just totally related with this question, I would like to pass the floor to Matt Jacobs that Franak mentioned, because it's part of an ongoing effort from US actually to tackle this disinformation. Matt, the floor is yours.
Join in. I was anticipating just coming here as an interested party, as an interested participant, but I want to just give a quick note on the idea of collaboration, cooperation across governments in particular. As Franak has alluded to, I work with a number of governments across Europe. Actually, I should say, I'm the digital coordinator for the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs at the US Department of State. So I'm in charge of designing our digital strategic communications policies and tactics, as well as how our messaging and our approaches seek to not just kind of counter disinformation and misinformation, but build the capacities and the kind of social competencies for information to distribute and inform effectively across digital channels. But working together with multiple stakeholders and multiple governments has been something that has become increasingly necessary in modern communications practices. In general, this can be broken down to about just a few quick reasons. The first one is that, as everyone here is aware, is that our media operations have mainly transferred over to this. As was mentioned earlier, the amount of ad buys that go to Google and Facebook versus traditional media have been flowing in a direction that champions internet mediums more so than your traditional broadcast outlets, whether that be print or television or radio. And while they're still not dead, we're seeing the trend move to that direction. So it's quite important that we take our internet communication seriously and not as a secondary operation or as a secondary place of putting communications products that would have otherwise been designed or generally slated for more traditional media outlets. But the problem is that the information space online tends to evolve at a path or at a pace much more quickly than governments are capable of adjusting to. Governments themselves are quite slow, cumbersome entities. As was alluded to earlier, even our approaches on countering disinformation are kind of fractured and factionalized across different entities, not even just within the government, but sometimes also within the same department. So the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs has an element of that portfolio, whereas the GEC, which is also within the Department of State, has a different portfolio. It makes it a bit difficult for us to keep up in general, and other governments that may not be as well resourced, as well staffed, or as well trained, certainly can't be expected to keep up with all the different changes, all the different mediums, all the different kind of lexicons and ways of which people operate in operational line. So the only way for governments to really come and be able to compete at the level of someone like Russia or China or other private or non-state aligned nefarious information actors is to figure out how to really reach that digital literacy curve, how to share our common best practices that, say, one government developed over another, and make sure that all strategic elements and all strategic partners are able to learn from and operationalize those things without having to relearn or re-innovate, recreate the wheel, and therefore slow down the speed of progress or the rate at which we can reach out to effectively to our citizens' bases. Because usually it's easier with a marker, as governments kind of chug along and trying to increase their digital capacities. I don't know if my arm's going the right direction, we'll see. And they're doing it at this kind of slow linear curve. The rest of the information space is operating at a much more nonlinear exponential curve. And our audiences tend to follow that one much more than ours. And it's that gap in between this arm and this arm, and where everyone else is going and where we're going, where disinformation is most often able to thrive and to take root. So the more we can kind of work together to kind of increase that curve through collaboration, cooperation, and sharing, the more effectively we're going to be able to minimize and mitigate spaces in between audience expectations and desires and our capacities to deliver on that. And of course, Franak, Vlad, and I have been talking for a while now about how to bring our communities of practice together. I primarily focus on government representatives. The DCN is at least start out with a lot of kind of more civil society organizations, journalists, et cetera. But there is a need to cooperate across these sectors, and Vlad, Franak, and I are on it. So hopefully I'll see you guys a bit later.
Okay, thank you, Matt. I mean, this is what actually DCN is working together with World Learning. Vlad Spencer is a crucial factor in this effort, actually, in order to tackle this gap that Matt described, and the necessity actually to bridge over and build up a coherent response to what we have seen all across the field, because everyone mentioned that we have to move in different levels, but adopting the same, let's say, methodology or philosophy. I will just wrap up the following questions in order to finalize our today webinar. The one comes from...
Can we?
Yes, Franak?
There is a question from Maxim Kiyak from Ukraine. He was asking from the very beginning, about when everything started with China, actually, and some examples about collaboration of Russia and Chinese disinformation. Perhaps Seth and Bob have more examples. I just wanted to say that, I don't think it started in 2018. Even, with this gaming industry and Chinese investments, it started 10 years ago, 2010 and 11. China made huge investments in different sectors everywhere in the world, including the United States. But in 2017, 18, 19, they made huge step forward in the digital space. They realized they can play on this market. And TikTok, it is the PD product. It's a public diplomacy product. On one hand, they create a social network, with all these opportunities and limitations. But on the other hand, it's public diplomacy. They organize festivals, they collaborate with MTV, they go to public schools in high schools in the United States, giving T-shirts to kids and their parents. So China just realized how to do it more efficiently, quicker and cheaper, in the last 1 or 2 years. Bob said, do you have any points here?
Yeah, I do. I definitely do.
It's
a good question, Maxime's question. So, it's particularly when we're talking about government agencies and with disinformation that often brings in military or intelligence organizations. It's harder today, this week, this year, to identify examples, definitive examples of cooperation, because we don't have access. Even looking at this issue over the Cold War, it sometimes took time for information to get declassified. But I think, one interesting component is how a number of countries, including the Chinese and the Russians, begin to center their messaging around specific issues on COVID-19. So I think in a sense, at the very least, we're seeing loose coordination. So as I mentioned earlier, we've seen examples of the raise this issue. We've seen it from Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokespeople that the U.S. may have actually brought the epidemic to Wuhan, and the U.S. may have put out the virus or establish the virus at Fort Detrick, Maryland, similar to what we saw during the Cold War with Operation Denver. But we saw almost immediately Russian and Iranian outlets saying essentially the same thing. So there's a new outlet funded by the Russian Ministry of Defense, which published an article. It was called Coronavirus, American Biological Warfare Against Russia and China. And it argued that Washington had unleashed COVID-19 against Russia and China to weaken their economies. Kind of an odd claim, since obviously weakened the US economy as well. But there was an article from RT which claimed that the US could be the prime culprit behind COVID-19 outbreak. And at the same time, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in Iran released a statement saying that it's possible this was a virus produced as a biological attack by the US, also highlighted Fort Detrick, Maryland. So I would say in general, this is an interesting example, at the very least, of what I would call loose coordination. We don't know to what degree they were actually talking to each other. They may have been, but we do certainly have evidence of those countries, China, Russia, and Iran, repeating exactly the same themes on their, and in some cases, not just on informal, but on state-run systems, and also by government officials. So I think that's an interesting example of at least a what I would call loose coordination.
And what I'll add, Seth, to what you were saying is, when I look at repressive regimes in general, they have three very clear steps that they take. And so if we look at China and Russia in this case, what do? Step one is let into China all of the Russian related information that will disinform and make the case for China. That's step one. Step two is don't let in any ex-China information into China, block it all, and make sure that it doesn't cross the borders into China. And then the third is make sure you tell the story that you want everyone to hear within your country, and then push it out to the world. So every repressive regime tries to follow that three-step model. China is just really good at it. Others are not as good at it. Then when you get into distributing the information, I think the reason why we see maybe there's coordination is if you're moving content out worldwide, you don't actually really care who's moving it. If you're China or Russia, you just want who are the willing parties. They could be in the diaspora. They could be totally random. They could be, you don't care. You just want to, you just find the like-minded people and move it. And that actually, in fairness, that's the same thing in a positive way that companies do when they're trying to shape behavior in a market to sell something. So they're very good at it, but it's that three-step process that is followed over and over again.
Great. Shall we wrap up the final questions? I mean, in order to try to respond to all the questions. So one question comes from Anastasia that's asked, what do you believe about EU actions in order to tackle disinformation, whether or not they have been effective? The other question is from Ioanna Georgia, which she asks, in what way European Union practices could be communicated in a better way? How actually EU can tackle disinformation? And the last one, what else? And the last one comes from Alicia that she actually asks whether or not the US or the West in general have done the same thing in Russia and China. So these are the final questions. Who wants to take first? The one is about the EU response.
Happy to jump in to start.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bob.
I would say two quick things. One is an issue, and one is something we can do. We know the rules in the EU get in the way of going against those who are bad actors. So these same rules that protect the privacy and safety of individuals in the EU don't allow us to actually track individual people to understand exactly what they're doing, so we can actually be more effective at reaching them. So I think we have to start looking at rules we put in place to protect society versus rules we put in place to deal with bad actors. And we may have to be a little more lenient there if we have the chance to make more progress. That's one. What can we do? The second item is I was involved not that long ago with training groups that deal with, I guess you call it hate speech, extremism in Europe, about 45 different groups. If those groups shared the same keywords that were related to what people are searching for, their content would actually have an outsized impact on search, and we would drive bad actors off those first screens, and we would get more of the right stories in place. But because those 45 groups all work independently, all passionate, all want to do the right thing, that will never actually have the impact of driving those bad actor sites off the first screen. So we have to learn how to coordinate in new ways. And coordinating, for example, on keywords to impact search is extremely simple, obvious, but it just takes the discipline of doing it.
Thank you, Seth. And then Franak.
I'm not really an expert on the Europe side, but I am happy to tackle Alicia's question on doing disinformation on Russia and China. And I just two answers to that question. I mean, disinformation, the way it has historically been used is sort of government, particularly intelligence agencies, putting out false information. So I think in that sense, I mean, I would say the answer is no, and this is important because I'll give a caveat in a moment. And my understanding is the focus of U.S. intelligence agencies right now is primarily trying to understand, and let's take COVID for example, the source of the COVID outbreak. Was it wet markets? Tying it to bats, and then better understanding the source of the information. And so there are some huge legal challenges with U.S. intelligence and law enforcement agencies putting out false information on their websites or in the public domain. There are also huge challenges to U.S. intelligence agencies also conducting any kind of information against their own population, against the U.S. population. So, I mean, my answer on the disinformation side of the U.S. is probably not. The problem, though, is with politicians, and that is, there have been, in my view, statements coming from some politicians, legislative, executive branches that are not truthful in some cases, maybe outright lies, and I think that is problematic. And they have dealt, since we're dealing with COVID-19 in part here, on the origins of COVID-19, potentially tying it to laboratories, military laboratories in and around China. And I think getting ahead of where intelligence or epidemiologists are that are doing research on this is a problem. So I think in the very technical sense of our intelligence agencies putting out disinformation, again, my understanding is at least at this point, probably not. I think the challenge is are politicians saying things along those lines? And the answer there is yes. I think that's not a surprise. Politicians have done this for a long time, but I think it's unhelpful in this environment, particularly on issues that we've been talking about today.
Thank you, Seth. Franak?
I think Bob and Seth covered very well.
Okay. If you have any final remarks, otherwise I will do the closure of the event. Firstly, I would like to thank everyone that participated and actually posted all questions, comments, etc. They were very valuable. And this is what DCN and the CE stands for, a vibrant and active community that goes beneath the surface. And this is why we really thank our speakers today, both Bob and Seth and Franak as well, for being part of an event that it is being organized from Digital Communication Network that is based in Thessaloniki, and World Learning, and also the Digital Communication Network worldwide, that covers a lot of actually areas and countries, and which is supported from US Department Citizens Exchange Office. We would really like to thank you all. Our next webinar will be next week. Please follow up, because we will equally have a very interesting topics, such as regarding the blockchain. Once again, to our speakers, thank you very much. Matt, thank you very much for your intervention and the short, let's say, presentation. And our thanks and gratitude to everyone else that participated and made this discussion very lively. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
See you again.